Elaine Showalter's The Female Malady, Women, Madness, and English Culture explores the historical and cultural construction of women's mental illness in England, tracing its evolution from the Victorian period to the late 20th century. The book examines the ways in which psychiatric discourses, medical practices, and cultural representations have pathologized femininity, situating these developments within broader social and political contexts. Showalter's central argument is that madness has often been gendered as feminine, with women disproportionately represented as patients in asylums and as figures in cultural portrayals of insanity. The book opens with an analysis of the Victorian period, during which the association between women and madness was solidified in both medical and cultural discourse. Showalter examines the rise of psychiatry in the 19th century and its focus on domesticity and femininity as central to women's mental health. In this period, deviations from traditional gender roles or expectations, such as resistance to marriage, sexual transgressions, or intellectual ambition, were often framed as symptoms of mental illness. Victorian asylums became spaces where these unruly women were confined and treated, reflecting societal anxieties about controlling female behavior and preserving social order. Showalter delves into the cultural construction of hysteria, a condition disproportionately diagnosed in women, often used to reinforce gender stereotypes. Hysteria became a catch-all diagnosis for various emotional or physical symptoms that were poorly understood, often linked to the uterus and reproductive system. In medical theories of the time, this gendered framing of madness reduced women's suffering to biological determinism, obscuring the social and psychological factors contributing to their distress. Showalter argues that such medical practices perpetuated patriarchal control over women's bodies and lives, aligning with broader cultural narratives that depicted women as inherently fragile and unstable. The book also examines how these themes played out in literature and art, where the figure of the madwoman became a recurring motif. Victorian novels, plays, and paintings often featured women driven to madness by love, betrayal, or social oppression. These representations both reflected and reinforced the cultural association between femininity and mental instability. Showalter highlights how such portrayals served to contain and marginalize female rebellion, framing it as a pathological rather than rational response to societal constraints. However, she also identifies moments of resistance in literature, where madwomen are portrayed as tragic figures whose madness critiques oppressive systems. Moving into the 20th century, Showalter explores how the gendering of madness evolved alongside changing social attitudes and advancements in psychiatry. The early 20th century saw the rise of psychoanalysis, which introduced new ways of understanding mental illness, but often perpetuated traditional gender norms. Freudian theories frequently pathologized women's desires and identities, linking their mental health to their roles as wives and mothers. Showalter critiques the ways in which psychoanalysis reinforced the notion that women's primary source of fulfillment lay in the domestic sphere, further stigmatizing those who deviated from these expectations. The mid-20th century brought shifts in the treatment of mental illness, including the development of psychiatric medications and the deinstitutionalization movement. While these changes offered new possibilities for care, Showalter notes that they did not fully dismantle the gendered biases in psychiatry. Women continued to be overdiagnosed with conditions like depression and anxiety, often receiving treatments that prioritized conformity to social norms over genuine empowerment. Showalter argues that the medicalization of women's emotions and experiences persisted, reflecting ongoing cultural anxieties about gender roles and authority. One of the book's strengths is its attention to the intersection of gender and power. In the history of psychiatry, Showalter examines how the institutionalization of women served not only as a medical practice, but also as a form of social control. Asylums and psychiatric treatments were often used to silence women who challenged patriarchal authority, whether through political activism, artistic expression, or personal choices. By framing their dissent as madness, society delegitimized their voices and reinforced traditional power dynamics. Showalter also considers the role of feminism in challenging these narratives, particularly in the late 20th century. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s brought attention to the ways in which psychiatry had pathologized femininity and suppressed women's agency. Feminist critiques of medical practices, including the use of psychotropic drugs and electroconvulsive therapy, highlighted the need for more inclusive and empathetic approaches to mental health. Showalter discusses how feminist writers and activists sought to reclaim the narrative of women's madness, framing it as a response to systemic oppression, rather than an individual failing. The book concludes by reflecting on the enduring legacy of these cultural and medical practices in contemporary society. Showalter argues that while significant progress has been made in understanding and treating mental illness, gendered biases continue to shape perceptions of women's mental health. Women remain disproportionately represented in diagnoses of mood disorders and are often subjected to stigmatization and misunderstanding. Showalter calls for a more nuanced and intersectional approach to mental health, one that recognizes the social and cultural dimensions of suffering without reducing it to biology or pathology. Throughout The Female Malady, Showalter employs an interdisciplinary approach, drawing on historical records, medical texts, literary works, and visual art to construct a comprehensive narrative of women's mental health. Her analysis is both critical and empathetic, highlighting the ways in which cultural representations of madness have shaped real-world practices and policies. By situating these developments within their historical contexts, she offers a nuanced understanding of how gender and power intersect in the construction of mental illness. Showalter's work is notable for its balance between critique and advocacy. While she critiques the ways in which psychiatry has been complicit in perpetuating gendered stereotypes, she also acknowledges the complexity of mental health and the genuine challenges faced by both patients and practitioners. Her call for a more inclusive and empathetic approach to mental health resonates as a timely and important contribution to ongoing debates about gender, medicine, and social justice.